This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and today is Monday. That means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to take a look at the Ogre creature type. I've looked at many creature types over the years in the almost 600 episodes of this series, but there's still some fairly plentiful ones that I've never done an MTG Top 10 on, like Ogres and Scouts, which I gave people a choice between in a poll over the community tab. In the end, Ogres came out on top, so that's what we're looking at today. Ogre is one of Magic's oldest creature types, with Alpha's Grey Ogre the first one ever printed. Over the years, they've shown up with regularity, and they are more plentiful on some planes than others. For example, Kamigawa, Ravnica, and Tarkir prominently feature them. They most typically appear in red, black, and green. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have the Ogre creature type or be capable of creating an Ogre creature token. In all, there were 127 cards eligible for this list, and in this video, we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's take a look at the top 10 Ogres in Magic. At number 10, it is Hellhole Flailer. This 3-mana 3/2 comes with Unleash, which means when it enters the battlefield, you can choose to put a +1/+1 counter on it. If you do, it can't block. So in addition to being a 3-mana 3/2, it also has the option of being a 3-mana 4/3 that can't block. You can also pay 4 mana and sacrifice it to have it deal damage equal to its power to target player. Obviously, if you chose to unleash it, this effect is going to be more powerful and can result in the Flailer doing a ton of damage. Decks that use the Flailer usually aren't super interested in blocking anyway. However, it is nice to have the option in a situation where you do desperately need a blocker. The Flailer was played in Rakdos aggro decks while it was in Standard, but it doesn't have any points since 2012. At number 9, it is Kazoo, Tyrant of the Cliffs. This 5-mana 5/4 Ogre taxes your opponent whenever one of their creatures attacks. They have to pay 3 generic mana for each attacking creature, otherwise you get a 3/3 red Ogre for each time they don't pay. Importantly, this triggers for every single creature that attacks you, which means your opponent is going to have a super hard time keeping from giving you Ogres anytime they attack with more than one creature. This deters attacks quite well, as giving up the ability to add to your own board simply to attack is pretty rough. Kazoo was played in the sideboard of Temur control decks while it was in Standard. It was pretty nice to bring it in against aggressive opponents that would have a hard time dealing with the 5/4 Kazoo, and also have a really hard time ever being able to pay his tax. It doesn't have any points since rotating out of Standard. At number 8, it is Menace Ogre. This 5-mana 3/3 Ogre comes with Trample and Haste. Notably, it doesn't have Menace, as you might expect. Back then, the ability hadn't been keyworded, otherwise they probably would have given the Ogre a different name. Anyway, when it enters the battlefield, each player chooses a secret number, and then each player reveals their number. The player with the highest number loses that much life. If you're the one who picks the highest number, the Ogre also gets 2 +1/+1 counters. This is actually a really cool design, and one that actually made this card competitive and Onslaught block constructed. You would really find yourself in a win-win situation when you were in an aggro deck running this at the top of your curve. If your opponent chose a larger number, well, their life is now a lot lower, so killing them will be easier, and if you picked a higher number and paid some life, you also have a 5-mana 5/5 with Trample and Haste, an absolutely incredible rate during Onslaught block constructed. It was played in Goblin aggro decks, despite not actually being a Goblin, because it fits so perfectly into the deck's aggro game plan. It never gained points in other formats though. At number 7, it is Hidetsugu Kaiiri, the newest card to make the list. Hidetsugu Kaiiri come from March of the Machine, the most recently released standard legal set. This card depicts the team-up of the Kamigawa Ogre Demon Hidetsugu and the Dragon Kaiiri. It's a 5-mana 5/4 with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you basically cast Brainstorm. In other words, you draw 3 and put 2 cards from your hand back on top of your library. When Hidetsugu Kaiiri dies, you exile the top card of your library, and your opponent loses life equal to that card's mana value, And if it's an instant or sorcery, you get to cast it for free. The great thing about this is that the Brainstorm effect helps you set this up in the first place, and getting any free spell out of Hidetsugu's death is pretty amazing, especially because if they aren't dealt with, you still have a 5/4 flyer that is a real problem. It is seeing play in standard Grixis control decks right now. One of the sweetest things you can do with it in standard is combine it with Explosive Singularity. If you can put this on top of your library with the ability, and then sacrifice Hidetsugu and Kaiiri, you do 20 damage to your opponent because you cast the spell and it does 10, and the Hidetsugu trigger makes your opponent lose 10 life. At the time of recording, decks using that combo don't actually have any points. Instead, it's found success in more typical Grixis control decks. Hidetsugu and Kaiiri have a lot longer in standard though, and have a very real chance at eventually being the number 1 card on this list. At number 6, it is Gosbon Ogre, one of Magic's earliest ogres. It was one of 2 in Arabian Nights, Magic's first ever expansion. It's an impressive 1 mana 2/2, though it does of course come with a downside. During your upkeep, the player with the most life gains control of the ogre. While that downside is significant, the decks that used the ogre were mono-green aggro decks in standard and extended that generally made sure their opponent never had more life than they did. The ogre itself helps make that the case, since it's an absolutely massive creature on turn 1, especially in the days of Arabian Nights. If a game did ever reach the point where your opponent had more life, you were probably going to lose anyway, so the downside wasn't all that relevant. It hasn't gained any points since 1999. At number 5, it is Gruul Spellbreaker. This 3 mana 3/3 comes with Trample, and it has hexproof as long as it's your turn. It also comes with Riot, which gives you the option of putting a +1/+1 counter on it or giving it haste until end of turn. Either option gives you a nice return on your investment, as a 3/3 with haste and trample or 3 mana 4/4 with trample is pretty impressive. Having hexproof on your turn matters too, as it means that if you choose the haste option, you can often get in for a hit even if your opponent has some way to respond. It gained all of its points in standard Gruul aggro decks, and so far hasn't managed to see significant play in other formats, though it does see some fringe play in Pioneer, so gaining more points in the future isn't impossible. At number 4, it is Crimson Fleet Commodore. This 4 mana 5/2 Trampler makes you the Monarch when it enters the battlefield. As long as you're the Monarch, you draw a card at the beginning of your end step. Your opponent can become the Monarch if one of their creatures deals combat damage to you. The turn you play this, you get this high-powered trample body and draw a card, which is pretty great. Even if your opponent does manage to take the Monarch from you right away, the fact you have a 5/2 Trampler means you have a good shot at getting it back on your turn. Like a lot of Monarch cards, the Commodore sees a lot of play in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal. It's going to keep gaining points in that format in the future, so it has a pretty good shot at continuing to move up the list. At number 3, it is Rurik Thar the Unbowed. This legendary ogre has vigilance and reach, and he harshly punishes players for casting non-creature spells, inflicting 6 damage every time they do. Rurik Thar does have to attack each combat, but his size and vigilance help reduce the downside of that. Since non-creature spells are usually what someone has to use to remove a creature, it's very difficult to deal with him without taking a significant chunk of damage. He's been played in aggro sideboards in both standard and modern, but doesn't have any points since 2017. At number 2, it is Savage Knuckleblade. This 3 mana 4/4 costs 1 of each Temur mana, and comes with a slew of activated abilities. You can pay 2 generic and a green to give it +2/+2 once a turn, you can pay 2 generic and a blue to bounce it to your hand, or you can pay 1 red to give it haste until end of turn. Each of these abilities has their place. If you have extra mana the turn you play it, giving it haste is pretty nice. If your opponent has a larger creature around, buffing its stats can make that less of an issue, and its ability to bounce to your hand means you can have it dodge removal. The Knuckleblade was played in Temur midrange and aggro decks in standard, and Temur Delver decks in modern. However, it hasn't gained points anywhere since 2016, and it's very likely that Crimson Fleet Commodore and Hadesugu and Kaiiri will eventually pass it. And at number 1, it is Hadesugu Consumes All, so 2 separate Hidetsugu cards made the list. This starts out as a saga. Chapter 1 lets you destroy each non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. Chapter 2 exiles all graveyards, and Chapter 3 transforms it into an ogre shaman called Vessel of the All-Consuming. This is a 3/3 trampler that gets a +1/+1 counter when it does damage, and when it damages a player, if it's dealt 10 or more damage to that player, they lose the game. That last part isn't super easy to do something with, but you do get a nice creature to go with a removal spell that hates on the graveyard, all for only 3 mana. It hasn't done much in Standard, mostly because Chapter 1 doesn't consistently have things to exile, but it has done a ton of work in formats with larger card pools where decks tend to run many powerful permanents that Chapter 1 can get rid of, and graveyard strategies are more common in those formats too. Modern is by far the format where it's made the biggest impact, where you can expect to find at least one copy of it somewhere in the 75 in any deck that is capable of casting it, but it's also done a lot of work in Historic and even found some success in Legacy. It's very likely to remain the #1 Ogre in Magic for the foreseeable future. So those are the top 10 Ogres in Magic. If you want to own any of them, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at creature types, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.